All right, welcome to the Land Sale Success. I'm so excited that you're here. And if you are in this workshop, it's probably because you've been wondering about how can you maximize the sale of your property. Maybe you're just on the fence of selling your property and trying to figure out if this is the right decision for you. Or you are looking at as selling your property as just a possibility for the future. So we're going to go ahead and dive right into it. First off, to go through what you should expect to learn by the end of this workshop is what we're going to be covering. First and foremost, land value clarity. And essentially, I'm going to be going through three different sections within these major headers, but we're going to talk about like what are those main topics that we're going to be covering today. Then we're going to be going into taxes and timing, okay? And I'm not a tax professional, so please, this is going to be a very high level overview of understanding, what taxes you should be expecting, and then, what is that timing for your sales of your listing your property potentially? When should you plan on doing these sales? Then we're going to be going through the building your sale plan, and this is going to be things that you need to know, as well as how does this process actually work and look. And then finally, next steps and a Q&A option. All right, a little bit about me, because I know we have some familiar faces, but we also have a lot of new folks here. And so just a quick introduction, I'm a wife and homeschool mom of 3, and they are very likely to be interrupting me at some point. I also have over 11 years in forestry. So I graduated with my Master's of Forest Resources from the University of Georgia at the end of 2013. After I graduated, I worked with the Georgia Forestry Commission for about 4.5 years, and then worked for various nonprofits as well as starting my own consulting forestry business where I helped women, primarily widows, on how to manage their family forest lands. And this April, I officially, closed the doors on that previous business and switched gears slightly by getting my real estate license of the April of 2025. And now I combine both of those passions of forestry as well as helping families understand how to sell their family property and how to buy family land or investment property, and then have that solid foundation of what to do with this land moving forward. So I'm officially a land sales agent with Carter Group. And then lastly, but not least for sure, is I'm a Bible living Christian, which means almost all of my teachings, all of my emphasis, my recommendations, my advice do have some sort of scriptural foundation to it. And I believe in incorporating Jesus and my faith into all areas of my life. Okay, so we're going to get started with that first section, that land value clarity. And what we're going to be covering in this particular section is how to decide if selling your land is the right decision for you, which is the starting point of even any of this conversation, factors that impact value, how timber and land are different but interrelated, and then to subdivide the property or not. So let's start with deciding if selling land is the right thing for you. I spent the last 5 years really helping women, primarily widows, on how to manage their family land that they've inherited the role of and how to keep it within the family. However, I did always state that selling the land sometimes is the right option for you, and I would even go through steps of how to determine if selling land is the right decision or if selling land should be part of your succession. So I'm going to be going through a few of those factors that I've discussed in length at that point. And one of those is the fact that maybe you don't have any beneficiaries, or the children or any other extended family members have absolutely no interest in taking over the property. And second is perhaps, maybe they do have some interest, but they're simply long distance or out of state. Or perhaps you are long distance and out of state. Long distance can make it very difficult and challenging to decide how to manage the property. And when you are that far away, you do tend to feel a little bit more disconnected, and property starts to kind of creep up into that liability factor because you simply are not able to keep your eyes on it nearly as much as if it was local or within even a few hours of you. It has the risk of, increasing the trespasses, increasing the opportunity for people to dump on your property. And then, of course, for you to tend to not manage it nearly as much as if the property was near you. And so long distance or being out of state from your property is a lot of reasons people will sell the property. And most of the time, from what I've noticed, is you'll sell that land and perhaps get a piece of property that is closer to you that you'll be able to utilize a lot more efficiently and effectively. Then there's the change of values. Now, change of values doesn't necessarily mean like change in values from your faith or how you view your family. It's typically has something more along the lines of Perhaps you utilize this asset, this land base all the time. But as the family aged, as the family moved away, perhaps you're just not, you know, going to the property nearly as much. And now that land that you and your family used to go hunting on all the time, or perhaps you would come together and do family Thanksgiving retreats or family reunions on, simply does not happen anymore. And so the change of values may be okay, we don't necessarily want to come out and perhaps utilize or visit this property or use this property in the same manner. So we'll sell it in exchange and, perhaps do something else, whether it is to get a beach house that you and your family or you and your spouse can go to, every year, every summer. It also can be, you simply want to liquidate those finances and invest them into different things. Perhaps you want to invest into your children's college funding, your maybe a business venture one of them might have. Or, along with those change in values, it could also be just the changing market dynamics for that area. And so something that had a really strong, maybe farming community or really strong timber community, a lot of those changes have happened around, and those values just aren't quite the same for that area. Perhaps there's been a ton of development around and surrounding your property. And so what was easy to do for your timber management, your family management, your hunting on the property has now become more cumbersome because of that increasing development around you. And so selling that land and choosing to do something else instead, might be the right option for you. And then last but not least is going to be, family tensions. When it comes to land, it's amazing how all of a sudden, especially during that estate planning process or that estate probate process more so, how land can be such a divisive factor within the family. Members that didn't care necessarily anything about the land of the past now all of a sudden care about making sure they get their fair share. And so folks that might be bickering and causing a lot of tension on who gets what and how that land is going to be divided, sometimes the best option in those cases is simply to sell the land and divide the financial aspects equally amongst the beneficiaries or amongst whoever. Okay, so now that we've talked about, very briefly trying to decide if selling land is the right decision for you, and if you've checked marked any of those options, that's something that you definitely want to have a deeper conversation about. But let's talk about what factors impact your value of your land. And I got my nice little quadrant. I was definitely feeling quadrants this workshop session, so we're going to be going through this a lot. But in this quadrant, we have your timber type, okay? So when I'm talking about timber type, what I mean is like what type of forest is actually out there. You have your plantation pines, you have hardwoods, uplands versus bottomlands, and then you have a clear-cut land base. Depending on what type of forest you have out there in conjunction with your markets, which is a different section, may depend on that value of that property. And so, for example, plantation pines with a lot of poles and saw timber, really high quality products that's been managed really well, is going to generally have a higher value than a natural pine forest that's never been managed. It probably has very few products. That's going to have a lesser value because there's simply not as much merchantability. And same thing when it comes to uplands versus bottomlands, depending if it's been managed, if it has ideal habitat, and if it has ideal merchantability products, that's going to change on how that value might be out there. Having good solid white oaks compared to live oaks. Live oaks don't have as much merchantable value, but have a lot of aesthetic value. But when it comes to timber harvesting potential, your live oaks are going to decrease the value that you could have on your overall property compared to having a lot of white oaks or red oaks or poplar or something along those lines. And then cypress swamps compared to a loblolly bay. Cypress swamps, more value. Loblolly bays tend to have lesser value. Both merchantable, just a different type of quality product. And then same thing with clear cut. Obviously with clear cut, there's absolutely no timber out there, but it has the opportunity to be replanted. Now we're going to be talking about access. Okay, access can greatly impact how your property can be valued. So for example, is it on main paved roads or are you off of dirt roads? Or one step further, is your property landlocked? And if it is, does it have legal easement access to your property? And then lastly, what type of internal road systems do you have? Access is such an underrated, one of those subliminal type of value characteristics that you can't necessarily put a dollar sign on. If you are off of a main road, you're going to get X amount of dollars more compared to a dirt road because both provide you access, right? But something about having a main paved road greatly increases your attraction of the buyers, attraction to how quickly you might be able to get to different development or to other areas compared to dirt roads. Dirt roads, you generally have to drive slower. It usually possibly may be a lot longer route. And especially if you again are looking at logging, just using that as an example, driving on dirt roads takes significantly longer, which is going to increase your travel time to and from the mill compared to paved roads where you can go faster and have a faster return time, which makes it more appealing because time is money in that essence. Same thing when it comes to how a buyer might view a piece of property. Paved roads generally have an increase in value over dirt, but they're both going to have a higher increase of value of accessibility compared to a landlocked property. Now, if you have no idea what landlocked is, landlocked means you're essentially surrounded by other people's land, other people's property, and you yourself are not directly on a paved or a dirt road. When it comes to landlocked properties, you definitely need to make sure you have some type of deeded legal easement. That's really going to be the only way that your property is going to be even somewhat appealing. And I talk about legal easements because having a handshake deal with Joe Smith for the last 20 years doesn't necessarily count. Because if something happens to Joe Smith and now all of a sudden Robbie Jones has taken over his property, that handshake deal is essentially null and void. He may not honor that deal that you had with the previous owner now that he is in charge. And so having something legal, having something permanent is going to make your property more appealing. However, not quite as valuable in terms compared to paved roads versus dirt roads. And then, of course, I've already mentioned this, the internal road systems. The more road systems you already have established on your property, the significantly more valuable your property is going to be seen because now they don't have to take the time and invest into that infrastructure because roads are typically one of the most expensive operations you can do on a piece of track, on a piece of property. So having really good road systems is going to significantly increase the value and the perceived value for your property, the appeal that it is going to be for landowners. Then we have markets. And I touched on this very briefly when I did talk about timber type and the quality of timber. And all of that is significantly important and related to markets. And when I talk about markets, I'm focusing on forestry and ag markets and then development. These are two significant different things that can be marketed on how your property might be appealing. So when it comes to forestry, just for example, since I am a forester, this is my bread and butter, and this is what I can talk about a lot more, is, Southeast Georgia, we have strong forestry markets. And even though there is, some changing in the wind and just how these different mills are working, but there still is strong forestry markets in this area. And so land that has been managed as plantation pines especially is going to be a lot more valuable compared to natural land. Now, comparing that tract of land in Southeast Georgia with plantation pines that have been managed to, say, something in Northeast or Northwest Georgia in the mountains, even if you have plantation pines that have superior, pole products, is not going to be nearly as valuable as here in Southeast, just simply because of the markets. The markets are much further away from any of the tracks, especially when you take in the time it takes to go down mountain systems. The markets are just not quite as prevalent. And so even though there are markets for your timber, for timber harvesting, it is valuable. It's definitely much more of a niche type of market area up there. It's not going to be quite the same tit for tat. A pine plantation is much more valuable here in southern Georgia compared to northern Georgia. On that flip side, though, you have your development. That same mountain feature may have significantly more, development opportunities, development value, especially, say, mountain views, compared to something in southern Georgia that maybe isn't necessarily on the coast. So you can see there's a little bit of a tit for tat trade. And so your markets, how close you are to different, opportunities. And the same would be for your ag lands, depending on the ag commodities and depending on where those ag markets are. A blueberry field in, blueberry world and a lot of blueberry markets, definitely a lot more valuable compared to a blueberry field out all the way in North Georgia, okay? It's just not going to be the same. You have to understand what are those local markets around you to be able to know if what features your land might have is increasing the value to your land, or if it's pretty much a negligible aspect to it. And then location. And this is going to tie in a little bit more with the development factor, but also with that buyer perception. So when it comes to location, I'm thinking counties, aka school systems, and then also distance from town. Okay, so when your property is very close to, say, some of these urban sprawl areas, you got your Brunswick, you got the islands, you got Savannah, Augusta, Atlanta, these big city areas or these big suburban areas more so. If you have property near those growing subdivisions, growing suburban areas, your land is going to be naturally considered more valuable because you're going to have that increasing development pressures, which is going to naturally increase the per acre rate for your land alone. But you also have that increase in growing communities, increase in buyers as well. So it's a little bit of a twofold there. But the counties themselves, when I talk about counties, I'm usually referring to, in this case, for school systems. That if someone is looking to buy a piece of property to build a home site on or a homestead in, to move to, whether it's 5 acres or 50 acres or 500 acres, if they're looking to actually move to it, the counties themselves, which usually goes in hand with the school systems, are going to play a factor in how valuable. So just for a simple example here in Southeast Georgia, we'll just use Glynn County versus Brantley County. Glynn County, of course, has higher per acre land because of the growing area of Brunswick, because of the accessibility and the proximity to the islands. So land in Glynn County is a lot more appealing, especially when it comes to development, compared to Brantley County, or even one more over, you get Bacon and Pierce, being a little bit further away from the growing areas, the growing development. And so that's just looking from a land to land type of value because of that growing development. And then, of course, if you look at Glenn versus Camden, Camden being really appealing often for their school systems, that land value is going again to naturally increase because of the good school systems, a lot of appeal of a lot of people wanting to move down there to be within that county alone compared to if you were to move to Charlton County. Now, if you're strictly looking at land to invest for timberland or hunting and have nothing to do with a home site or homestead, you definitely, would want to, from that buyer perspective, look at land perhaps right next to these highly appealing, high value land counties. But depending on where your land may be, you don't necessarily get a choice on, how does that impact what your land is? But it is something to keep in mind. So if you had friends say on the island, why are they getting $200,000 for their 1 acre lot on the island and you are only getting $25,000 for your 1 acre lot in Brantley County? And I'm not saying these numbers are real, I'm just giving like really extreme examples here of why there would be such a difference. And it usually is very much related to school systems and development opportunities and development appeal. So I'm going to stop harping on that horse right now. And we're going to move on to timber versus land, okay? Now, I mentioned this in a little bit when I talked about timber type and markets. So timber has its own value system, which is separate from your land. But when you are listing your property or valuing your land, they are very much interconnected, which is why you don't necessarily get a price of your timber is worth this much, your land is worth this much, unless you get a timber cruise from a consultant forester. Your prices are going to be relatively interlocked, interrelated. And so although you don't necessarily get a price of, poles are going to increase my property by this amount, by Y amount, you will see that if you have very mature timber, poles and saw timber that's been managed well, you're going to have a higher overall value because it's merchantable and it's a high quality product that's merchantable compared to, say, your natural forest land that doesn't really have a whole lot of pines. And when it does, it's maybe small or has a lot of deformity. So it's all considered pulpwood. And if you have a live oak savanna, none of that's merchantable per se. So that timber quality is not going to be nearly there, and it's probably going to decrease your per acre value in that regard. Now, a lot of your timber is also going to more or less, compound. Do you have high quality products that's been managed well along with good road systems? That's going to significantly increase your value compared to I have a piece of property that hasn't been touched in 40 years and has no road systems. That's going to decrease the value of your land base. And that's just looking from the forest property alone with some of basic infrastructure. The more managed it is, the more appealing it is, which means you can kind of market it. Again, for example, managed property that has longleaf pine has a longleaf pine straw lease that's been burned on the other side of the property every 2 years, now has an increased marketability to hunters, and you can give some of that extra information, which is going to increase the value of your property because now you're showing alternative revenue streams that can come from your land base, as well as good habitat for your hunters and for your conservation-minded individuals. That's going to increase the value, the per acre value of your property overall. So I've been asked the question, what's best, to leave mature timber or to cut it first and have a clear cut? And this is going to be one of those it depends questions. And I know it's probably not what you want to hear, but the truth is it really does depend. It first off depends on what are your goals for that land. And then it depends on that buyer. Like when you're looking at those two things combined, when I say what are your goals, are you looking to maximize your profit from the sale? You may be thinking, well, of course I am. Well, take that a step further. When you think about maximizing profit, does this mean you're willing to wait to get the most per acre? Are you looking to get, as much money as you possibly can, but also sell it within the next 4 months? Those are going to be two different versions of maximizing. And then, what type of seller are you trying to target with your land sale? Mature timber is going to be very much appealing to your hunting retreats, to your homesteaders potentially, to your timberland investors, to somebody that, is looking to perhaps create their own aesthetics on the land. Even if they are looking to do some type of development, perhaps they want the advantage of cutting the timber. Leaving your mature timber is going to give you an overall higher value per acre and appeal to a certain set of individuals, and typically a little bit more buyers potentially. So you're going to have a little bit more value opportunities there compared to a clear cut. A clear cut is an eyesore, it is ugly. However, for someone looking to do some type of development, perhaps you are near some urban sprawl and so you're marketing it for commercial subdivision, or perhaps maybe you do a clear cut for a home site that's going to be converted to pasture land. That's going to be a lot more appealing. So even though you are getting a lesser per acre rate because there's literally nothing else standing out there, it is going to be significantly more appealing to someone looking to develop it because now they don't have to worry about the hassle of cleaning it. They just have some logging debris they got to brush up, and that is done. They can go instantly to work. So it's not necessarily a what's better, it's a what are you trying to target and what is your goal for the sale. And then lastly touching on volume and acreage. The amount of acreage you have on land is also going to determine that overall value. Now, this again is a little bit of an it depends. There's kind of like a catalyst point where the more acres you have, the more appealing it is to a certain degree, and then you get a very niched market, a very niche avenue of buyers you are targeting with your land base. And then along with the size of acreage you have, the volume of timber you have out there. And that really does go hand in hand with managed versus unmanaged. That's kind of what it mostly comes down to. And stereotypically, unmanaged doesn't have a lot of volume, is going to be less valuable. Managed usually has more volume, is going to be more valuable. And if it comes to someone looking for timber investment or honey land, so usually you're going to be looking at that 50 acres or more is going to increase your value. Less than 50 acres, you're targeting more of those homesteaders, and the timber itself is not going to play as much of a factor typically in the value overall because you're going to be usually doing a little bit of a different market spin. Okay, so that leads us to this, do you divide? Because I teased the fact that there's kind of this like arch of acreage that at a certain point, it's not that more acreage downgrades the value of your property because the more acreage you have, you are sitting on millions of dollars essentially, especially if you have hundreds or thousands of acres that you're looking to potentially sell. However, you really bottleneck the number of buyers and appeal of who can actually afford that and who is looking for that type of investment. Okay. So a lot of folks, look and try to weigh out, do I subdivide the property? And we're going to be going into some pros and cons of subdividing, of why you might choose to do that. So subdividing pros, we're going to talk on this side first, is your subdividing is going to give you naturally a larger audience because you're taking something that is large and dividing it up into bite-sized pieces that a lot more buyers can look for, especially with the homesteading, home site development where people are looking to branch out and have more space naturally to build their own homes or even add their own mobile homes or modular homes and just have their space for their own crops, for their livestock, for goats, whatever it might be. There's this whole homesteading trend of just getting back to a more simple life. Subdividing is very appealing, but that range is typically between 5 acres and 25 acres. Okay, that's that target trending market right now. And so you're going to have a lot more buyers if you do choose to subdivide into those smaller parcels, which are naturally going to give you quicker sales because you have a lot more buyers who are looking for this and able to, bite off of this type of investment. You're going to have quicker sales. And because you're breaking it into smaller pieces, you usually are going to have a larger profit potential because you're going to be increasing that per acre, that money per acre rate. And so say you might have been charging $2,500 an acre for 1,000 acres, you might be looking at say $5,500 an acre for 30 acres. And those are not reasonable in any form or fashion, but I just want to kind of show how you would change that per acre rate because usually when you are subdividing, you are targeting home site, homestead type of development, and home site acreage and markets have usually a much higher development value, higher per acre rate, which is going to sometimes give you a larger overall profit margin. Now, some of the cons that comes with subdividing is it is going to take a longer time to actually get to market, and it can take a longer time to complete your sales. So we're just going to use 100 acres. If you take 100 acres and divide it into 20-acre parcels, you might sell the first 3 20-acre parcels really quickly, right? Because again, larger audience pools that are looking for that. But it might take you a long time to sell those final 20-acre parcels. And so even though you get quicker sales on individually, as a whole, to finish the 100 acres, not always, but it can, and something you should prepare for, take a longer time to finish the process of selling all the land. You're also usually going to have higher upfront costs because subdividing the property takes more work. It takes more effort. And so some of those costs can range from, doing some seller surveys upfront. If you do and you pay to get it subdivided yourself, pay for the survey to formally subdivide it, it's going to be a lot more appealing to your buyers, right? Because it has already been done. You have a fresh survey that you've already accomplished. They know exactly where those boundaries are. There's no gray area of it's roughly around here. They know exactly what they're getting, and that's way more appealing to potential buyers. But that is going to be a cost you will have to endure up front, and that also goes with your longer time frame to list. And because you are now looking instead of one big parcel at multiple parcels that you're kind of juggling, especially in conjunction with surveys, whether you choose to do the survey up front or you just want the buyers to handle the surveys afterwards, that's still a lot more work for your listing agent that they're going to be working through. And so usually there's going to be some higher seller commissions that you should be expecting as well, because they're handling a lot more logistics along with that. Also, should be noted, if your property is in CUVA, this may not even be an option for you. If you don't know what CUVA is the Conservation Use Valuation Assessment that reduces your property taxes in Georgia, because you have your land in conservation, in forestry or ag of some sort. Typically, you have to have at least 10 acres and it's a 10-year covenant. But this varies from county to county. So every single county has their own specifications and rules when it comes to CUVA. Some counties will say, yeah, you can subdivide it as long as the new owners continue to honor that CUVA, those restrictions, that covenant with the county of keeping the property in forest land. And the subdivision does not go below the covenant requirements. And the covenant does allow some home site development. And so when you're subdividing, you have to make sure that you have that grace room in there that allows for a home site to be created potentially while still not breaking that covenant. While on the flip side, some counties will say, no, absolutely not. We do not want any fragmenting of the original CUVA covenant. You are not allowed to subdivide this property in any form. So it's really important for you to understand, what does your county allow, because this can also change from tax assessor, their director. I don't know what their formal name is actually, but what the person in charge in office says. And say it's been one way for 10 years, but now you have a new tax assessor official and he has decided to change it. And so even though it might have been one way for 10 years, if you especially have a new elected official in there, the rules may change. So you really need to really make sure you understand, what does your county allow, because this may not be an option and you don't want to get into the weeds of it to find out only later that you cannot do this, or you have subdivided too small and now you have to deal with the ramifications of the back fines and the penalty fees. So that's your pros and cons when it comes to subdividing. Let's talk about the pros and cons about keeping your property as a whole tract. You are going to have that higher marketability potential. And with this, what I mean is, since I just talked about how you would have a larger audience potentially with smaller acreage, here I'm talking about larger investors' marketability. When you have more acreage, you are much more appealing to timberland investors, those that are looking to manage and diversify their investments to timber. You are much more appealing to those looking for hunting retreats, especially if you have significant acres, premium hunting retreats. You are much more appealing to those perhaps looking for commercial development, looking to do some type of subdivision. The more you have there, it's going to be more appealing to those types of individuals. So you're going to have more of that marketability opportunity to play those angles. 100 acres is much more appealing for managing timber than 20 acres. 20 acres is very, very challenging. You really can't market to manage the timber on 20 acres nearly the same as 100 acres, and 500 acres is way more appealing than 100 acres, just to give that basic example. Also, when you keep it all together, you are keeping and maintaining your conservation values. If you had the strong drive that you want to see this land stay in forest land, stay in ag land, as your granddaddy had it, keeping it as a whole is going to help maintain that. And those that are likely to buy it, unless you are specifically marketing it for commercial development, are going to have probably very similar values. And so, when you keep it as a whole, you are essentially saying, these are my values, these are what I want to pass on, and you're targeting buyers that have those same values by simply keeping the property all together. Now, the cons with keeping whole tract together is what I already talked about. You're going to have a little bit more of a bottleneck audience pool of buyers potentially, which means you usually are going to have a longer sale time. It's going to take a little bit longer to be on the market because you have a smaller audience who are looking for that type of tract. And the more acreage you have, that smaller that audience is going to get. And so what that means is you simply just need to be patient. It's not going to sell in a weekend. These aren't necessarily like residential homes that might be up and sold in 14 days. Yes, they absolutely can, but when it comes to land, whether you subdivide or not, these usually are going to take longer. And then the more acreage you have that you keep together, the even longer that's going to typically take. And that's typically also going to give you a lower per acre rate. Again, this is going to depend on the quality products and everything else you have out there. But if you say had 500 acres of timberland, you might be marketing that or listing that at 4,500 an acre, 5,500 an acre, okay? And I'm just throwing numbers out there. I'm not saying that that's what it's worth. But if you had subdivided it out, you might be looking at 9,000 an acre, 10,000 an acre, and then multiplying that out multiple times, okay? And so you're going to have a little bit lower dollar per acre, but you're going to be getting all of that at once. You're not going to be dealing with maybe having these loaners, like you had the subdivision of loaner 5 acres left that simply is just not selling for whatever reason or is taking a long time. So neither one is better than the other. They're just different considerations when looking at your property, and then considerations depending on your location of what might be the best route to go for you, your family, your goals, and your location. So let's move forward from here and let's briefly get into taxes and timing. And I'm going to be doing a high-level overview for capital gains, stepped up basis, which is essentially, what do you expect with inheriting property? I'm going to briefly talk about 1039s and what are like the straight go-to things you need to know about 1039s to consider. And then the question has been sent to me, what are the best times to sell land? What is the best time that I should consider listing my property? That is not right. All right, so let's talk about capital gains and stepped up basis first. Now, as a reminder, I am not a tax professional, okay? So always make sure you're talking with a tax professional to understand what your situation is and understand the latest updated tax code, tax law, and how that might affect your decisions, okay? But let's just go through the high level view of capital gains and stepped up. Capital gains is, and we're going to be focusing on long-term capital gains, is the taxes that you would pay on the profit of your asset when you sell it. And when you keep it for longer than 1 year, those long-term capital gains, as land usually typically is, you're going to be taxed at 15% of your profit. So if you had purchased the property, say at $100,000, it is now worth $150,000. You've kept it for more than 1 year. You have that $50,000 that you would be taxed at 15%. Okay, that is capital gains in simple math right there. Now, stepped up basis is, specifically for if you inherited property. And this means that the profit is now going to be based off of the value of when you inherited it. So if your parents purchased a piece of property at $25,000, you inherited it when it was worth $100,000 and it is now worth dollars and you decide to sell it, you only have to do the difference between 100 and 150. So you are paying the capital gains on that 50,000 rather than that 150 minus 25. So rather than doing the capital gains on that 125 of what your parents purchased it. So that's really the main difference. But again, make sure you're talking to a tax professional when talking about these things to make sure that the tax code and things haven't changed for your situation. Since we had talked about selling your timber in a few of the discussions, I did want to also remind you that there are taxes associated with selling timber. So if you choose to sell your timber before you do enlist and sell your property, you do need to make sure you prepare for your severance taxes and your capital gains. Severance taxes are those taxes that get paid to the county, and then your capital gains, your federal and state, federal capital gains, you need to make sure you prepare for that. And there's ways you can minimize your selling timber, but this is not a forestry conversation on how to maximize those profit margins. And so it's just something I want you to be aware of and prepare that you would have taxes for that and then taxes for actually selling your property. Again, I cannot reemphasize this so many times. Talk with a tax professional to understand your particular tax implications for that particular year because things change all the time and they're going to have their finger and hands on a pulse of how that's going to directly impact you. Okay, so what about 1031s? Okay, I mentioned that I was going to be teasing this. What is a 1031? What does that look like? 1031s are strictly and foremost for investment properties only. So what does that mean? It means that if you wanted to sell your land, sell your house, and buy a new home site, that would not count. You cannot roll that property into a 1031 to buy your new home site. It has to go from investment to investment, okay? So, and it can be different types of assets. It can be timberland to beach house or, rental property to timberland. You can change the investment style or structure or whatever that language might be, but it has to be for investment, okay? It also has to be a tit for tat trade. You do have a very limited time frame. You do have to identify your property. I think it's within 45 days of selling your property, and then you have to complete the closing on it within 180 days, I think it is. And it has to be of at least equal value or more. And so what that means is if you sell your property for 500,000, you find something else new for 300,000, that 300,000 would be your 1031, but you would still be expected to pay taxes on that other 200. You don't get the whole 500 free because you chose to do a 1031 and found a cheaper property. You are allowed to upgrade, of course. So again, sticking with 500,000, if you found something for 500,000 and you sold, or if you found something for 700,000 and you sold your property for 500, you rolled that 500 into the new property for 700, and say you sold some other assets, or maybe you took out a loan for the remaining two, that would be allowed, okay? But it has to be of at least equal value. And then lastly, and most importantly, you want to make sure you're working with an attorney and a qualified mediator before you do and decide to actually sell your property. If this is something you want to look into, you want to talk to these individuals first, because you are not allowed to touch the money in any form or fashion. There are so many strict rules and codes and regulations when it comes to 1031 that you want to make sure you're working with professionals who understand the latest updates of whatever is happening, and that you ensure you have all of your T's crossed and I's dotted, because you do not want to mess around if you mess this up, okay? So if this is something you're interested in, definitely get with a qualified mediator, talk about your situation, and I promise they'll let you know whether you qualify for this option or not. And then the last thing I did want to share, because the Carter Group actually held a 1031 exchange type of event back in April, and the one thing that I learned that I had no idea about was that once you do a 1031, you always want to do a 1031. And so what she meant by that is, like, if you decide to do this one time and you roll in to, say, a beach house, and then say 10 years later, you're like, okay, I'm tired of the beach house. I don't want to do anything else. I just want to sell. I don't want to deal with anything else. You sell that beach house, you now owe the capital gains taxes on the beach house as well as on the original property. So that's also another reason why it is of the utmost importance that you talk to a qualified mediator before you do this, because the last thing you want to be stuck with is if you do this exchange once and decide to sell out, now you have double taxes that perhaps you weren't prepared for. So talk with them, understand if it is the right situation for you, and then understand how to go about the process to make sure you're doing it correctly. Okay, so let's touch on when are the best times to sell. You hear about the housing market, now's a great time to sell, now's a slower time to sell, and all these different things. So when it comes to land, what does that look like? And the answer is really going to be it depends, but I'm going to be talking about seasonal trends and a few other considerations when it comes to selling your land. The first one with seasonal trends, I got it broken down into like two main seasons. We got our spring and our summer, and we have our fall and our winter. So I'm just splitting the year out in half. When it comes to spring and summer, you are naturally going to have an influx of buyers, of people looking to buy land specifically for hunting season. Folks that are looking to buy their own piece of property, their own piece of land to actually take their family out, have their own personal hunting retreat. Spring and summer is when that's going to spike up in preparation for deer season in the fall, okay? So those are great opportunities to list your property, especially if you have really good wildlife habitat. Spring and summer, of course, are going to be great for those looking to move. You have a lot of people that are, when it's dry, when it's between school seasons, especially if maybe you have a smaller acreage plot or tract that can be marketed for a home site or a homestead. Spring and summer are going to be your great options there, because they're going to be looking to buy and move onto these properties before the next school season. So what does that mean for the fall and winter? All right. Fall and winter, it does naturally have a little bit less, active buyer searching because of the holiday busyness. However, there is one catch that so many people tend to miss, is that there's also going to be less competition. And so what that means by less competition, I mean, is because not as many people tend to list their property to sell in the fall and the winter, that if you choose to list in the fall and the winter timeframe, your property is going to be new. It's going to be seen way more quickly because there's a lot less new opportunities coming out to the market. So listing your property in the fall and winter is going to have some huge advantages that a lot of people do list in the spring and summer in preparation for that hunting season. But listing in that fall and winter time can really give you that edge that your new property is going to be almost immediately seen by those buyers that are out there shopping on the market. So it's not a necessarily better than, but they are different, and there are definitely advantages to both sides of the coin. All right. So other times to sell, and this is going to go in conjunction with you deciding to sell, are going to be some major family events. And so what type of family events would you want to look at to consider doing a land sale? And it is going to be your estate planning succession. This is definitely your most popular options to look at and say, how do I want to sell the property in our succession type of planning? Do we want to sell the property before, we die? Do we want to put it in the will that the property should be sold upon, death in probate and divided appropriately? Those are some of those decisions of like, how do I want this to go along with my estate planning discussions? Then you have your retirement and life changes. And although you might think, well, wouldn't those go along with succession? The truth is yes and no. So just like you could utilize timber harvesting to help, offset retirement funds or retirement needs, college funding for the kids or grandkids, you can also utilize, considering doing a land sale at that same time. Especially, so just like I would look at logging to help you leverage your retirement needs or college funding or whatever it might be, you can look at selling your land or selling that asset in the same manner. Now, what do I mean by that is, I mean, if you are looking at your retirement years and perhaps your dreams are to travel or to move to a different area, selling your land is one of those assets that can help you leverage and kickstart some of those dreams, especially if your retirement plans in any form or fashion have to do with moving away. And especially if, again, you don't have any beneficiaries that are looking to take over the property, or taking over the property is going to cause a ton of family tension, a family division and strife. This is one of those opportunities that you can look at as that time period, that this selling at this time period, let's wait till you get here. You can maximize your management plans, your alternative revenues, maybe even doing some timber harvesting in conjunction with these life changes, with this selling of the property at that point in time. There are other, types of life changes that might cause you to really need to sell the property. And, without getting into a lot of the weeds, again, just referencing the fact for the last 5 years that I've worked with widows. And my biggest advice when you came to that moment, and I usually was referencing it when it comes to logging, timber harvesting, but the same is especially true when it comes to selling your property, is to take your time. So if you're in any type of major life change, perhaps widow or loss of a parent, or other situations that have a ton of emotion attached to it, the last thing I want you to do is to make a major decision such as selling your land right on the heels of that. You do need to take your time, reflect over it, have those conversations, but right on the heels of it, you need to take the time. You need to be reflecting, sit on it, and then after whatever amount of time period might be appropriate, then make that decision if selling your land is the right and appropriate reason for you. And if you're in that type of mindset and you're trying to navigate and figure out, is this the right decision for me? Am I just feeling overwhelmed? You can definitely shoot me a call, shoot me a message. I've spent 5 years. If I can help you continue to keep your family land within the family, that's a win in my book, in my opinion, because I know how important it is that these land assets have to generations and that generational intangible value. And so if I can find ways to help you manage it confidently and sustainably, I will definitely help you look for those ways. Moving on, we are then going to be talking about, best times to sell if you are doing any type of timber harvesting. These are things you need to keep in mind. If you want to sell your timber and then you want to sell your property, you kind of have a few different routes you can go about this. You can either place a timber reservation on the property, or you're going to be looking at selling cleared land or clear cut land, assuming you're not doing some type of residential cut or thinning. Those are also options that are not necessarily left here, but you can do maybe a partial timber harvest and then leave the remaining timber, depending on the age structure, depends on what might be appropriate for you. But one note I would add when it comes to timber reservations are, honestly, I do not recommend doing a timber reservation, primarily because they are so unappealing to the buyer side. You're going to greatly reduce the options and number of buyers that are even going to want to purchase that property while there still is that timber reservation. And it simply is because of the fact they don't necessarily want any strings attached with the land. And so if you're looking at which one is better, to place a timber reservation or to sell a immediately logged, clear-cut, cleared land, the clear-cut, cleared land. Because at least at that point, they have the free reins to do whatever they want to do with the property, whether it's for development or replanting or placing a home on it. They are able to completely do what they want. When there's still a timber reservation left on the property, you're kind of tying their hands on the options of what they can do for a particular time period. Now, again, even if you're just selling a timberland investment, essentially what you're doing is saying, hey, I'm selling this property to you, but I get the benefit of harvesting this timber, but I want to sell the land to you right now. And most folks are just going to wait till that timber reservation time frame ends. And so it is to your advantage to just go ahead and wait listing it until after that point. It's just going to be much more appealing. Now, when it comes to cleared land versus replanted land, like when I say reforestation versus natural, I'm talking about what does it look like? Reforested, replanted land is a lot more valuable and a lot more appealing to buyers. And so it is going to be highly recommended, in my personal opinion, to even invest, say, $250 to get some loblolly planted into your property per acre, get it some, good stocking level. That's going to be way more appealing to a buyer. You're going to get much more value from your land sale at that moment, and a lot more offers and interest versus doing a cleared cut. Again, the exceptions being if you're marketing that clear cut to really strong development needs, it's going to be a little different. But looking at natural land that started to grow up, that hasn't sold immediately after it's been logged, that is now starting to have a lot of that brush, not going to be nearly as appealing as something that's been intentionally replanted. And so best times to sell after you've harvested, if you plan on harvesting your timber, and or if you can wait after you've replanted. Wait that 6 months to a year after you planted. If not, if you don't want to wait that type of time frame to actually replant the property, then highly recommend just list it immediately after the logging is completed. Okay, so we've gone through now the taxes, the timing, we've talked about the land value clarity and what factors impact your land value. Let's talk about building out your sale plan. What does working with a real estate agent look like? Why should you work with a real estate agent? What you need to know to actually do the sale, what you should have information beforehand. How does this process work? And I've gotten the question, if I'm out of state, do I have to do anything different? So we're going to be talking and touching on, if you are out of state from your property, how you might want to proceed. So first things first, let's talk about the benefits of working with an agent. And working with a real estate agent is going to be really similar to all the times that I've talked about working with a consultant forester. And the benefits are going to be really similar, although slightly different. One of the main benefits you're going to be receiving from an agent is that they're going to manhandle all of those logistics, setting up the survey, making sure the appraisal is getting done on time, any soil sampling or testing that needs to happen on your property. the agent is going to be handling all of that. They're going to be ensuring you're meeting all these deadlines. When you decide to for sale by owner, essentially you are taking on that role of working with the closing attorney, talking to if there's a buyer's agent or just working with the buyers, trying to ensure and get the process continuously moving. And this can be a lot of stress on your own shoulders. And if you're trying to navigate, other things in life and work, perhaps this is going to be a really stressful, aspect of trying to handle and move things along. Perhaps you don't necessarily know like who to touch base with when it comes to appraisers, which appraisers should you be calling, how long is that survey going to take? How do you ensure to actually get one done? What is that deadline time frame you need to be working within one? So manhandling those logistics, I promise you, is like worth it just in itself to be able to hand over that entire contract and the process with the contract to somebody else who can just keep you updated. I promise you is worth its weight in gold. But next, we're going to have other benefits is going to be access to networks and access to markets. And I have these two kind of coming up at the same time because they are interrelated, but they're slightly different. So when I talk about access to networks, I'm talking about that peer-to-peer network, that influence of people, those peers, those colleagues, those coworkers, that are within the industry. The networks that you don't necessarily rub shoulders with all the time. As a registered forester, I have a lot of connections within the forest industry, and as a licensed real estate agent, I also have a lot of those connections with other land sales real estate agents. I have those connections with agents who are looking for different properties for their buyers, and in those, even everyday type of conversations, talking with them, you learn so much more of, hey, I have a property that perhaps I can even get sold before you've even listed. Maybe we're in the process of listing it. I have that conversation with one of other my colleagues. Maybe I remember them talking about looking for a property that's really similar to what you are about to be listing, and I can connect you with them and we can get this property sold. And honestly, that's something that I'm in the middle of right now. I had someone that's property I was working on listing. I also happen to have a buyer whose property I was looking for the aspects. And, I reached out to the buyer and I was like, hey, this property is perfect for you. What do you think? And was able to get those two together. So access to that network. I have a few other conversations where I have these buyers and just in general conversations of these agents talking about, things that are coming up on the market, maybe that aren't there yet, able to make those connections. So working with an agent is just going to give you access to those networks that are even offline that you aren't necessarily rubbing shoulders with. And then that brings you down to access to markets. So we know all about Zillow, you know about land.com. Those are your stereotypical places you think about when you're searching for land, you're going to be going to. I mean, I utilize both of those, open public markets all the time. But you also have the MLS. And although the MLS is really popular and well known for residential homes, it is less known for land and not quite as utilized. It is still there as a marketing opportunity that exposes your land in a market that you are not able to get access to because you are not a real estate agent. And so there are a few other marketplaces that you wouldn't naturally think about to list your property, or you won't be able to list your property because you do not have those same connections and credentials. So the access to the markets, that online, especially exposure in combination with those networks and peer-to-peer exposure is going to compound and I promise you help you maximize your profit from your land simply from those two factors. And then the stress relief you're going to be receiving from the manhandling is worth its weight in gold in commission for an agent. So if you're on the fence of if I sell this land, should I sell it myself and just, see what I can get out there, then I don't have to worry about doing any type of commission. I promise you, you're going to be getting so much more value, so much more interest, so much more opportunities, and therefore increasing that profit you're going to be getting from your property simply by working with an agent. But when it comes to agents, there is a difference between real estate agents versus land sale agents. So let's talk about the difference between real estate agents and land sales agents. So real estate, is such a common word these days that people talk about. I want to get a real estate agent and, that's all they really consider. They don't necessarily understand the differences between real estate and land sales agents or land sales specialists or whatever their team might be calling them. But there is a difference. And so when it comes to stereotypical real estate agent, you're looking at the residential homes. And yes, they can specialize in different things from, like premium luxury or coastal life, or, even maybe commercial type of aspects downtown. But they're still looking at residential homes. And so their skill sets are going to be really tuned in into what those typical procedures are going to be looking at, what those typical comps and values are going to be considering when it comes to homes that have more definitive structures and also have shorter time frames typically of what they can compare and working within the sales compared to land sales agents. And what land sales agents have that typical real estate agents don't is that knowledge of land and timber and recreation and how that value changes across that spectrum. How different timber types that we had touched on, plantations versus uplands and bottomlands and managed versus unmanaged, are going to change the value of the property. How timber versus non-timber, or the different soil types, or what a pond and creek access is going to do, what different wildlife habitats might look like, and how you might market them a little differently. What size acreage really means in terms of value. Where is that bottlenecking actually occurring and how you might market them. Just saying you can sell land is significantly different than marketing land the right way for those right buyers again. And I've seen it a lot, especially when it comes to potentially Zillow type of listings that are being sold by non-land sales specialists. You're going to see very generic descriptions on there. It typically talks about how much acreage there are, if it's forested or not forested, if there's any type of pond features, the logistics of like access and whatnot on there. But you don't see any major marketing or key characteristics like what type of timber is out there, what's the age class. It will say something usually generic, great for home site and hunting opportunities, something along those lines, but it's not specific. And it's usually only listed in like one area. Maybe it's Zillow and the MLS. And so there's just a key difference in selling land and knowing land to sell land. And as a forester, having all of my forestry background does give me even more of, I would say, a little bit of an edge by understanding timber, understanding trees and forest management so significantly, and alternative revenue streams and how that can impact and different recreational opportunities. And so, I really just want to emphasize the difference in land sales and real estate. But if you can get a land sales agent who has an even deeper background in land or forest management of some sort, whether it's a wildlife degree, a forestry degree, perhaps they've gone through those extra credential classes, such as, KW Land has their own network, and there's the ALC is a different credential course specializing in selling land. There's some extra credentials land sales agents will go through to ensure they can provide the best value for you on these land properties. But when, again, it comes to land agent specific networks, just like when it comes to residential real estate, land sales folks are going to have specific networks that they're going to be operating within a little bit more regularly, like KW Land, Realtors Land Institute Network. And these are important because, again, that peer-to-peer network that they're going to be connecting with to be able to advertise, to share your listing opportunities and find buyers who are looking for your type of property. There's the shotgun style on like Zillow of just saying everyone's going to see it, hopefully, and really fine tuning that marketing to the right areas to maximize the exposure to the right buyers. And that's what these land agent specific networks do provide. Now, I do love talking about red flags. And in this case, I don't have a ton of red flags that I want to mention, but there is one. And this is going to be a true red flag, whether you're talking about a real estate agent or a land sales agent. When you're talking and trying to decide to work with someone, my go-to is to always interview at least 3 people. And I'll talk about this again on the next steps. But interviewing 3 people is going to really help you decipher, give you that comparison of what's true, what's not true, and give you more comfortability of, I'm making the right decision. 2, you're not really sure, why they're giving maybe different answers. 3 is a little bit of that tiebreaker. But when it comes to these conversations, these red flags, you want to make sure that there's always a conversation about your goals before giving the value of the land. And so we kind of touched on this towards the beginning of this workshop, of this webinar, where I said, what is the purpose? What do you want to get out of selling your land? Do you want to maximize your profit? Do you want to maximize, the time period? Well, not maximize, minimize. Like, do you want this to be as quick of a sale as possible? Are you trying to, pass on conservation values, that you want to try to pass on this timber legacy to a new family? What is your goal and purpose on selling your land? Because there's a different way you can, chop up and eat an elephant. There's not just one way. Now you do have to start one step at a time, but there's multiple angles you can take a piece of property and look at it and sell it. And that's important because depending on your goals depends on the angle. We talked about subdividing. Subdividing or not subdividing might be dependent on what are your goals you're looking to get out of the property. And so someone saying, I can get you $100,000 for your property without even asking, are you interested in selling? And then what are you hoping to achieve? What is your goal? What is your purpose for selling the land? I want to make sure I, recoup some of my loss. I need to help, paying for this. I just want to sell this as quickly as possible because it's about to go into probate or part of the succession planning, whatever it might be. There's a difference in how that conversation goes by you understanding why are they selling this? What are they trying to achieve? And that changes on the different angles you might take, which is going to change, how things might get valued compared to just saying, I can get you $100,000 for your land. Your land's worth $100,000. So making sure those conversations do, at least at some point, ideally towards the beginning of your talking, is going to be talking about goals. Okay, so let's get into the things to know. And this isn't going to be an extensively lengthy list, but we're going to be talking about the key documents you should have or should have access to. And it's going to be your deed, your survey, and ideally any management plan details. Now, your deed is going to ensure, in your survey, having a deed and a copy of your survey, we can pull a copy of that. But making sure we're all on the same page, there's nothing missing, there's no misunderstandings when it comes to actually selling this property. That yes, you do actually own this property. There's no hidden encumbrances on it. That's going to show up on your deeds and such, but it's just laying it out there. You should have these things, and then we'll be able to pull them and you'll be like, yes, these are absolutely right and correct. Now, management plan details. Okay, this isn't something you would necessarily provide in your listing or necessarily need, but they can provide a ton of benefits when it comes to marketing your property. Understanding the past history. When's the last time it's been harvested? When has it been planted? How old are the trees? Is it prescribed burn regularly? All of this is just all of the meaty, juicy details we can share to tell the story about your property that's going to increase the marketability and the appeal to potential buyers. For example, saying it's been prescribed burn every 3 years because that's what your management plan said, whether you can confirm it or not. If this is, say, you've inherited the property and maybe you don't have as much knowledge, the management plan says it's been burned every 3 years. That's going to be a lot more appealing to potential hunters because that's going to share with them that this probably has some pretty good habitat, right? Because prescribed burning equals good habitat, lower understory. It's going to be a little bit of a cleaner site, that it's been actively managed. That tells a different story of a well-managed property for wildlife and even timber quality. Now, comparing that again to, say, we know that this was harvested in 2020, 5 years ago. That means we know in the next few years that it's going to be ready for another timber harvest. That's another marketability angle you can take to say you're going to be able to get some revenue by doing your next timber harvest in about 2 more years, right? And so that's something that the buyer is going to keep in their mind of like, oh, I can do a harvest in about 2 years and I can get some income that's going to be helping me pay for this property. So we can see here that the management plan isn't necessarily needed for listing the property, but can greatly help with the description and telling the story of your property. That's going to be so much more appealing to your buyers. Now, what does it look like once you found your agent, you've listed it? Now you have your marketing material expectations, okay? And this is when everything is going to be done on that back half. It's that storytelling, it's that listing creation. You got to get your map made, okay? Typically, most land sales agents are using Land ID at this point. You go on land.com, you see all these different maps at the bottom. Most of them are Land ID. So, although it doesn't take an excessive amount of time, depending on how big your acreage is, that's going to take a little bit of time for them to pull over, make sure your boundaries are approximately right. If there's any stand divisions that need to be in there, creating an aerial map. If it has a lot of timber, it's being marketed as a timber investment, having a stand map, maybe putting some of that extra inventory in there. Mapping. That's all I gotta say. Then to line up your photography, you may think, okay, well, how many photos do I really need? The more the better. You think about when you are browsing through Zillow or browsing through land.com. Properties that have a lot of photos and good quality photos are way more appealing to you. And again, marketing is all about telling your story. And so getting good photography, aerial photography, seeing things from above, seeing things from at ground level, highlighting really significant special sites is going to make your property more appealing. But photography takes time. You have to line up the photographer, they have to get out there, they have to download the images and send it to you. Perhaps you're doing a videographer, and you're doing some video aspect, a video tour on the property. Again, setting up that time. Likely they're probably the same people, but perhaps they're not, or perhaps they have to come on two different times. Setting up the time, and all of this is going to increase your marketability and appeal to buyers. And so although it is costs, obviously, it is going to increase your potential for offers and, good, ideally good offers, because you're telling your story a much more appealing way. But then, of course, we just have the general listing creations, the MLS, the land.com, cartergroup.com, all the other websites, the online websites that everything just has to be placed within. Again, that's going to take time. So what is that average time frame you should be expecting from listing a property, working with an agent, to actually having it public? Is anywhere from 2 to 5 weeks. Of course, there are exceptions. There's some properties that are a lot easier, can go on the market a lot quicker. On the flip side, if you decide to subdivide your property, and especially if you're going to take the time to survey it out first, you're probably going to be looking at maybe a little bit longer. And so I want to share this too, because you may say, okay, I'm going to sell my property and expect it to be listed this weekend. You need to understand there's a process in actually listing and advertising and getting it out on the public. And what I wanted to share is what I call the Carter Group special expectations here, okay? And so if you sign with an agent with Carter Group, with myself or one of the team members, for example, we have what's called a client portal. So I talked about that process of getting, a signed agreement to actually getting it to public. The client portal is what you kind of follow along and sees all those checklists, all those tasks that need to be completed to publicize your property. And you can actually follow along and ensure and see where your property is in the process of actually getting it listed. You can see the dates of when the photographer went out there, when the MLS listings were created, and this is going to give you that extra certainty of, yes, we are moving forward, even though it may feel like absolutely nothing's happening to you because your agent is handling it all. You can log in and see how much work has actually been done on your property and get that little extra boost of, okay, we are truly moving forward. We're almost there. Perhaps this is the holdup that's happening over here. Perhaps the photographer had to cancel on Friday. He's not able to come out until next Wednesday. And so that's an extra little hold up here. You can see when perhaps the social media marketing is going to be starting. Just these different things, these different checklists to see how far along you are in the actual process. And then once your property is listed, we now have what's called the monthly seller data. Okay. And I don't know if it's necessarily called that, but that's what I'm going to call it. And this is where you are going to be getting your monthly report to understand how much exposure and interest your property is actually getting. So you're going to be able to see, how many clicks on the websites are you getting? How many email interests? How many phone conversations have happened in connection to your property? And this is important because if you're waiting 3 months and you're like, why haven't I gotten any offers? Seeing what the monthly seller data is, okay, maybe we haven't gotten any offers yet, but we've had 52 clicks, we've had 5 email conversations and 4 phone call conversations, okay? And again, I'm just making up these email or these numbers right here. But that gives you like, okay, there has been click and interest, but why hasn't anybody actually offered it yet? And then that's a conversation you can have with your agent of like, why hasn't anybody submitted an offer if we're getting so much interest over here? And then on the flip side, you wait 3 months and maybe you're only getting 4 clicks or and one email and one phone call. Like that's going to be a different strategy tactic that like, okay, well, what are we need to do? What do we need to adjust from here to get more exposure, to get more interest actually clicking? Those are going to be two different conversations that you wouldn't know how to move forward unless you understand what are the numbers. And so that's what we really love about the seller data is you can really take hold and be like, okay, it's been 3 months, but now I understand this is where the analytics are falling. This is how it impacts. And then maybe this is how we adjust our strategy moving forward based off of how those numbers are laying out. Okay, so that's just kind of how that process works and you move through. But what if you're out of state? What do you do if you live out of state from your property? And the truth is, you're going to be going through the same process, except I highly recommended before, but I definitely want you to work with a local agent and a local agent to your property, okay? If you're out of state, you want to work with an agent who can represent you well and effectively and efficiently for your land, for your property. Now, if you're like, well, I don't really know who to call that's near my property, that's where referrals are going to come in. So, especially when it comes to real estate agents, we have a referral side of service that we can provide. And think of it just saying, like, you call up your friend Jamie, you're saying, hey, Jamie, who do you go to for your hairstylist? Or what dentist do you recommend that's really good for 4-year-olds? Those types of similarities is with agents, you want to find someone you trust. So, for example, say you have a property in Tennessee, you live in Michigan, and I'm here, you're on this webinar, you're like, okay, I trust what you like. Maybe you're familiar with me, and you're like, I trust what you're going to say and do. Who do you recommend in Tennessee that I talk to? I'm still going to recommend, you should talk to 3 people, but I'm at least going to be able to give you one individual's names. I'll be able to look and I'll say, hey, I think this individual is going to be really aligned for you. Give them a call and I'll do a referral. And yes, referrals are like a service that real estate agents can receive commission benefits from. But the most important part is that you're getting a referral from someone you trust, which means that they are going to take the time to ensure that you are getting referred to someone that is going to treat you right, treat you well, and help you complete the process effectively and efficiently. And this is going to be a much better place to start than just Googling real estate agents, land sales agents near, ABC, Tennessee, just for example. So work with an agent, and if you don't know who's near the area, ask for a referral from somebody that you do trust. So next steps, the first thing you're going to want to do is discuss and decide if selling your land is the right decision for you. So going all the way back to the very beginning, especially if you're on this fence, have those discussions with your family members, with other trusted individuals, have those discussions with real estate agents, ones that you can trust, and ones that you buy in their value and understand if this truly is the right decision for you. If you want to talk with me, I'm more than happy to have that conversation with you because as I've already said, that if I can find a way to help you manage your property, to get it sustainably within the family, staying within the family for generations to come, I love to do that. I understand the intangible feelings when it comes to land. However, I do promise to be completely honest with you that if selling your land is the right decision for you, I will be sure to let you know that. But I'm not just going to give you like, yes, absolutely. You need to think all of your options out thoroughly and then move forward on which one is the right one for you. The last thing you need to do is stay in this analysis paralysis. So after you decided that selling your land is the right decision for you, for your situation, and perhaps whatever that timing might be, you need to then decide on the goals for selling. So we've already talked about this. Do you want to sell as quickly as possible? Do you want to maximize your profit? Do you want to ensure that your property stays intact for conservation values as a timber farm, perhaps? Do you want to, whatever it might be? What are those goals of like why you're trying to sell this property. And then that's where the discussion is going to be with your agents of sharing, I want to sell my property, I want to maximize profit. Perhaps you're looking at subdividing and you want that conversation of what does subdividing my land look like compared to keeping it as whole. Having those kind of conversations with your agents and start interviewing them so they can give you those different perspectives and then you can choose one. And again, when you're interviewing agents, I love for you to interview at least three, and this is going to give you, better clarity, better confirmation, and better confidence in who you are working for, that they understand you, you can trust them, and that they are on your side. And then after that, schedule a free consultation evaluation. A lot of agents will offer you a free evaluation, or at least I know I do. So if you are ready to have those next conversation steps with me, I'd love to talk to you about what your goals are, what you're hoping to achieve, and then let me go out and visit your property and give you that initial value of what could you expect, ballpark, after I understand like what are the options I can share with you. This is how I think your property, could go for. Here's the strategy I think we could look at. I can give you that entire evaluation and value completely free as a free consultation before we move forward. And if you're ready to do that, let's connect. Email me at danielleatkins@cartergroupland.com. Shoot me a phone call or a text at 912-612-4953. This is my business phone number. Give me a call, give me a text at any time, and I will be more than happy to talk you through about what are your options, what are your opportunities when it comes to land. So I hope you found this helpful, and I hope I get to talk to you soon. Thank you.